Hello everyone and welcome to this week's episode of An Extra Slice of History with the Butterfly Princess. This week we're going to be discussing about the Victorian Workhouse. I'm going to be telling you about the Victorian Workhouse. So here goes. The Victorian Workhouse was a harsh institution established under the 1834 New Poor Law to manage poverty through deterrence, designed to be a deliberately astute. It housed society's most vulnerable orphans, widows, the elderly, unemployed and mentally ill, while enforcing grueling labour and strict discipline. Key features of the workhouse system: institutionalised structure and management. Workhouses were administered by parish unions, overseen by boards of guardians. Inmates were segregated by age, gender, and ability upon entry. Tearing families apart, husbands, wives, and children were housed separately, intensifying emotional distress, daily life, and labour. Inmates followed rigid schedules, waking as early as 6 a.m. to perform tasks like oatmeal picking, unravelling ropes for reuse, or stone breaking. Women handled domestic chores while men did physical labour. Work hours spanned between 10 to 12 hours daily with minimal breaks. Living conditions: food, meals, and manager. Meals were and repetitive. Grilled watery oatmeal for breakfast, thin broth for dinner. Charles Dickens famously critique this in Oliver Twist, where Oliver requests for more food leads to outrage. Accommodation dormitories were overcrowded, with children often sleeping four to a bed. Uniforms replaced personal clothing, stripping inmates of individuality. Sanitation: poor hygiene led to disease outbreaks like typhoid and cholera. Punishments and control: disobedience resulted in beating, solitary confinement, and reduced rations. George Orwell later described workhouses spikes as cold, dehumanising spaces where inmates were treated like criminals. Legacy and cultural impact: the workhouse became a symbol of Victorian social inequality while providing basic shelter. Its brutality reflected social views that poverty was a moral failing. Literal works like Dickens' Oliver Twist and Orwell's essays exposed its cruelty, fueling public criticism and eventful reforms. The Victorian Workhouse was created primarily to address three interconnected crises: rising poverty, social disorder, and changing moral attitudes towards poverty. Its establishment under the 1894 Poor Law Amendment Act aimed to: one, economic pressures, cost cutting. The pre-1834 Old Poor Law, dating to 1601, allowed parishioners to provide outdoor relief, cash or food to the poor at home. By 1930, this cost £7 million annually, 2% of GDP, gross domestic product, straining landowners. Post-war offensive: the Napoleonic Wars between 1803 and 1815 and agricultural depression left parishes bankrupt. Workhouses centralised costs through parish unions, slashing relief spending by 30% within a decade. ideological shift, moral condemnation of poverty influenced by and Jeremy Bentham, policymakers viewed poverty as a personal failing, laziness vice versa. This workhouse tested the observingness, though. Less eligibility principles, conditions inside had to be harsher than the worst paid labour outside. Deterrence, grueling tasks, bone crushing and family separation discouraged, but the most desperate. Fear of unrest. The 1830 swing riots, rural uprising against terrified the upper classes, workhouses. Cross-dependency and relief, forcing the poor into low-wage factory and mine work, segregating disabled unmarried mothers from society, urbanised industrial cities like Manchester saw slums where workhouses managed urban poverty while ensuring labour flowed to factories. The system reduced relief costs but deepened suffering, becoming a symbol of Victorian cruelty. Dickens' Oliver Twist, 1837, and the handover scandal of 1845-6 were starving inmates ate bone marrow, eventually spurred reforms through workhouses persisted until 1930. The Victorian workhouse system evolved over centuries, rooted in England's medieval poor laws, but reaching peak morality under the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act. 1388 Statutes of Cambridge. After the Black Death caused labour shortages, the law restricted working mobility and punished vagrants. 1536 Dissolution of the monasteries. Henry VIII's destruction of monasteries stripped the poor of church-based charity, forcing scale interventions. 1601 Poor Law made parish legally responsible for their poor, introducing outdoor relief, aid at home and early workhouses for the idle. 18th century expansion, 1723 to 1834. 1723 Workhouse Test Act required the poor to enter workhouses for relief, emphasising labour. 1782 Gilbert's Act allowed parishes to form unions for shared costs, though few adopted this due to funding issues. Industrial revolution pressures, urbanisation and rising poor relief costs reaching £7 million a year by 1830 fueled demands for reform. 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, the Victorian system. The Act centralised control under poor law unions, replacing outdoor relief and industrialisation. Less evil conditions inside were worse than the lowest paid. Family separate, men, women and children were segregated. Parents could only see their children weekly. Grueling labour, tasks like bone crushing for fertiliser and stone breaking were designed to deter all but the desperate. Model workhouse places like Southwell Workhouse showcase the system's ideal, strict routines, clean facilities and profit-driven tasks. Decline and legacy, late 19th to early 20th century. Public outcry scandals like the Hangover Workhouse 1845, where inmates ate rotting bones, and Dickens' Oliver Twist exposed systematic cruelty. Grandeur reforms. By the 1900s, workhouses shifted by housing the elderly and sick. The 1929 Local Government Act began covering them converting them into hospitals. Final closure. Officially abolished in 1930, many lingered as homeless shelters until the 1948 National Assistance Act established the modern welfare state. The workhouse remains a symbol of Victorian moral judgment and institutionalisation, poverty reflecting social tensions between charity and control. Typical conditions in Victorian workhouses were categorised by extreme and systematic cruelty and dehumanisations, routines designed to deter all but the most desperate from seeking relief. Living conditions. Overcrowding dormitories were packed with children, often sleeping 4 to a bed in rooms as small as 7 feet high or 88 feet long. Adults face similarly cramped quarters, fostering disease spread. Sanitation, poor ventilation and hygiene led to outbreaks of typhus, cholera and smallpox. Beds were reused for infectious patients without cleaning, and lice-infested straw mattresses were common. Uniforms. Inmates were stripped of personal clothing and issued coarse wool linen uniforms, symbolising loss of identity. Work and daily routine. Men crushed bones for fertiliser or broke stones using £28 rammers that caused exertion. Women's picked unravelling terry rope fibres for shipbuilders, a task that bloodied fingers. Scheduled days began at 6 a.m. with a bell followed by 10 to 12 hours of labour. Leisure was limited to 1 hour of silent segregated recreation. Food and nutrition. Meals: breakfast was grilled, watery oatmeal, dinner thin broth with occasional rotten meat. Scouts were intentionally nutritious and barely sufficient, leading to malnutrition. At Andover Workhouse, starving inmates grilled marrow from bones they were crushing. Family segregation. Families were split into categories: men, women, children upon entry. Husbands and wives were forbidden to interact, and children were isolated to prevent proper breeding. Psychological toll. Separation intensified trauma, particularly for children who faced it without parental comfort. Hierarchy of offences. Disorderly acts, noise, swearing led to loss of privileges like tea or butter. Refectionary acts, assault, drunkenness resulting in solitary confinement or flogging. Child abuse. Boys as young as 6 were canned for sleeping during church, and some were suspended in sacks as punishment. Medical neglect. Infirmaries. Sick inmates were housed in unventilated rooms, sharing beds with contagious patients or even corpses. Untrained, often illegitimate female inmates provided care until the 1860s. Death and burial. Those who died were buried in unmarked graves if families couldn't afford funerals. Coffins were reused. Legacy of cruelty. Workhouses became symbols of Victorian hypocrisy, where the poor was criminalised for poverty. Scandals like Andover and literal critics like Dickens spurred gradual reforms, but the systems persisted until 1930. Typical conditions in Victorian workhouses were categorised for extreme atrocity, systematic cruelty and dehumanising routines designed to deter all but the most desperate for seeking relief. We've read that bit. We've read this bit. That bit. Those who ended up in the Victorian workhouse were primarily society's most vulnerable and marginalised groups, forced into institutionalisation marginalisation due to poverty, social stigma, or lack of alternatives. Based on research results, the main categories included the destitute, unemployed, able-bodied adults unable to find work due to economic downturns, mechanisms or illness were compelled to enter, men laboured at grueling tasks like stone breaking while women did open or scrub floors, seasonal workers, for example, farm hands during periods of unemployment, vulnerable populations, orphans and abandoned children. Over 30,000 children entered annually, many sleeping forced to a bed in disease-ridden dormitories. Some, like Charlie Chaplin, were separated from parents in asylums or workhouses. The elderly and infirm, those too old or sick to work, were housed in squalid infirmaries, often shared beds with corpses. Mentally ill individuals lacking specialist care, they were grouped with undesirables like unmarried mothers. Social outcasts, unmarried mothers and fallen women seen as morally corrupt. They were segregated and shamed. Criminals and vagrants, petty offenders including gamblers or drunkards, were confined to deter idleness. Whole families entered during extreme poverty but were immediately split into gender-age categories. Parents could only briefly see children during supervised daily interviews. Charles Dickens temporarily entered as a child after his father's death imprisonment, later created the system in Oliver Twist. Henry Morton Stanley, the explorer, endured abuse in Welsh workhouses after being orphaned. Workhouses functioned as both a safety net and a tool of social control, designed to humiliate the poor into self-sufficiency. By 1839, nearly half of inmates were children, reflecting systematic poverty. People ended up in Victorian workhouses primarily due to systematic poverty, social stigma, and policies designed to deter resilience and public assistance. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act forced vulnerable groups into the institution as a last resort under harsh conditions. Key factors include economic collapse and unemployment, seasonal labours, stigmatised groups, families, orphans and abandoned children. By 1900, workhouses housed 250,000 people while intended to reduce relief costs. They deepened cycles of poverty and trauma. Immortalised in literature like Oliver Twist, the system wasn't fully abolished until 1930. The specific laws that forced people into Victorian workhouses centred on the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, which dismantled earlier relief systems and mandated institutionalised as the only form of state aid. The Cornerstone Law that abolished outdoor relief and requires all aid to enter workhouses. Key provisions: centralised administration. Parishes were grouped into poor law unions managed by elected boards of guardians, reducing local autonomy. Principle: workhouse conditions had to be harsher than the worst paid labour outside, ensuring the desperate would apply. We've gone through that. By 1840, over 90,000 people were institutionalised. The system cruelly exposed in scandals that sparked public outrage, but persisted until the 1930s. Poor Law Act finally abolished workhouses. Typical punishments for violating workhouse rules were designed to enforce strict discipline and deter idleness, often escalating in severity based on the offences, drawing from historical records and investigations. Here's how the system operated. Two-tier punishment systems. Workhouse offences were categorised as disorderly or refractory. Disorderly conduct included noise, swearing, or minor disturbances. Punishments included loss of luxuries, reduced rations to a bland diet of bread and potatoes. Refractory conduct included assault, drunkenness, or property damage. Punishments included solitary confinement in dark, unheated cells for days, flogging with rods or straps, especially for adult males, child abuse and rule breaking. Despite regulations, for example, non-corporal punishment for girls under 16, children face systematic cruelty. Boys as young as 6 were canned for sleeping during chapel or stranded in sacks. Girls endured beatings for minor infections such as leaving dirt in their rooms with wounds left untreated. Workhouse staff often ignored rules such as requiring 2 officials present for punishment to cover up abuse. Psychological torture, family separation, parents and children were barred from interacting even during meals to prevent proper breathing. Public humiliation. Inmates were forced to stand on stages overnight or wear stigmatising uniform, e.g. strap dresses for fallen women. Sick inmates shared beds with corpses and untrained, often drunk female inmates provided care. Starvation diets. At Handover Workhouse, inmates grilled marrow from the rotting bones that they were forced to crush. Punishments reinforced the lesser eligibility principle, ensuring workhouse was grimmer than the poorest labourers' existence, while reforms after scandals like Hangover led to minor improvements. Systematic cruelty persisted until the system's abolishment in 1930. Yes, punishment in Victorian Workhouse differed for men and women, reflecting gendered social norms and while core disciplinary measures applied to all inmates, women face unique forms of humiliation and control. Shared punishment for all inmates, solitary confinement, reduced rations and loss of privilege, physical abuse, flogging and caning. Gender stigmatising. Women labelled as fallen, e.g. unmarried mothers, wore striped dresses to signal moral copy or practice not imposed on men. Sexual surveillance. Women were punished for inappropriate conduct with male inmates, while males faced fewer restrictions on interactions. A woman talking to a man could result in shaming or confinement. Reproductive control. Pregnant women were segregated and infants were often removed to deter proper breeding. Men faced no equivalent penalties for fathering children out of wedlock. Women were punished for failing domestic tasks, laundry, cooking with extra cleaning duties or reduced food. Men faced harsher physical labour, for example, crushing bones. Refusal led to flogging or confinement. Psychological trauma. Mothers were forcibly separated from children. A policy, yeah, we've said that. We've mentioned that. Workhouse masters prioritise revenue, selling crushed bones and humane conditions. Health collapse, exhaustion, malnutrition and injuries, lung damage from bone dust were common. Elementary Education Act, complementary schooling for children aged between 5 to 13 in England and Wales. Workhouses were required to send children to school, reducing their availability for labour. Model Act 1880 made schools attendance mandatory up to the age of 10, further limiting workhouse masters' ability to employ children during school hours. These laws did not explicitly ban workhouse labour but prioritised education over work. Targeted Workhouse Reform Children Act 1908. Part of the UK's liberal reforms, this law prohibited children under 14 from workhouse most dangerous tasks like heavy machinery operation, banned night-time work for under 16s and restricted their hours to align with school schedules, mandated inspections to ensure workhouse conditions did not endanger children's health or education, Factory Act and indirect though focused on industrial settings, these laws influence workhouse factories. Factory Act 1844 limited children under 13 to 6.5-hour workdays in factories, setting a precedent for age-based labour restrictions. 1878 Factory and Workshop Act extended protections to non-industrial workplaces, indirect regulating workhouses. While the users focus is UK work, similar laws in US owned Act banned sales of goods produced by under 14s in late return, but inspired the 1938 Fair Labour Standards Act. India's Child Labour Act 1986 prohibited under 14s from hazardous occupations like carpet weaving. Enforcement challenges. Despite laws, workhouse children often preferred educational tasks like picking, treading, targeted routes under vocational training. Long hours during school holidays is seen in Hanover, the scandals of the 1840s. The Children Act of 1908 marked the first explicit legal barrier to systematic child labour in UK workhouses, but full came only within their closure under the 1929 Local Government Act. Children in Victorian workhouses typically enter as young as 3 or 4 years old, with most starting labour between the ages of 7 and 10, and remaining until their mid-teens. Their ages and roles were systematically characterised. Under 17 infants, these children performed tasks like cleaning or caring for siblings. Many were orphans or abandoned children. Ages 7 to 15 divided into boys and girls. This group did manual labour. Boys aged between 7 and 14 crushed bones, picked or worked in workhouse gardens. Girls between the ages of 7 and 14 laundered clothes, cut glue or sewed uniforms. Factories influencing early labour. Poverty. Families surrendered children's workhouses during crises like the 1840s Irish famine, where toddlers became institutionalised. Often hub workhouses absorbed street children as young as 3, assigning them to baby farms until deemed old enough for labour. Education laws. Before the 1870 Education Act, most workhouse children received no schooling, even after many worked 6-hour shifts before basic lessons. Harsh realities for young children. Infant mortality, 25% of workhouse children under 5 died from malnutrition or disease like cholera. Useful work. Expectations. By the age 7, children laboured 10 to 12 hours daily. A 9-year-old in Hanover workhouse reportedly grew rotten bones to survive. Gradual reforms, 1870 to 1900. Education Act. The 1880 Act raised the leaving age to 10, but workhouses often ignored this, prioritising labour over schooling. Apprenticeships, teens aged 14 upwards were apprenticed to factories and mines, continuation their exploitation. Workhouse industrialisation, child labour as young as toddlerhood, with systematic characterisation, ensuring even the smallest hands contributed to the institution's grim economy. Children were systematically preferred over adults in Victorian workhouses and factories due to economic exploitations, physical sustainability of the task, and social acceptance of child labour. Lower wages. Children earn between 10 and 20% of adult wages for the same work. In some cases, orphans received only food and shelter instead of payment. For factory owners save costs by hiring children as seen in the Gilded Age. In the US, where families relied on their income to survive. Small-sized children's bodies fit into machinery like textile mills and coal mine tunnels. We've done that. Some facts now about the Victorian Workhouse. 1388 statute of Cambridge, established after the Black Death to restrict labour movement, laying groundwork for state responsibility over the poor. 1601 Poor Law required parishes to support the elderly and infirm, and created workhouses for the idle poor. Outdoor relief and aid at home became common. 1834 new poor law abolished outdoor relief for able-bodied people, forcing them into the workhouse, designed to deter laziness by making conditions harsher than life outside. Daily life and labour, grueling tasks. We've done that. Working hours up to 10 hours a day for 6 days a week, with minimal pay or compensation beyond basic shelter. Living conditions, we've gone through that. Overcrowding. By the 1830s, some workhouses housed between 900 and 1,200 people, with infants and elderly crammed into unsanitary dormitories. High mortality. Up to 25% of children under 5 died in workhouses from diseases like cholera. medical care. Workhouse infirmaries provided redundant healthcare, often the only option for the poor. By 1920, 29 many became public hospitals, limited schooling. After the 1870 Education Act, children received 3 hours daily of basic lessons, often combined with labour like sewing uniforms. In 1929, local government act transitioned workhouses into hospitals and public assistance institutions. Right. Done that, we've done that, we've done that. Done that, we've talked about that. So, Victorian literature frequently depicted workhouses as symbols of social cruelty, with notable examples including Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist, 1837 to 39. Oliver Twist, the protagonist, is born in a workhouse and endures starvation and institutionalised abuse. His plea for more food, "Please, sir, I want some more," became a cultural indictment of workhouse conditions. Dickens' essay, A Walk in the Workhouse, 1850, describes the first-hand observation of a pauper's life, emphasising the dehumanisation treatment of inmates. Elizabeth Gaskell's 1848 novel, Mary Beaton, critiques the poor law's failure to address urban poverty, highlighting characters driven by desperation and unemployment and workhouse threats. Francis Trollope's Jessie Phillips, A Tale of the New Poor Law, 1843. A policymaker novel attacking the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, focusing on a pregnant seamstress denied relief unless she enters a workhouse. George R. Sims' poem Christmas Day in the Workhouse, 1878. A tragic narrative poem about pauper's humiliation during a holiday meal, exposing the hypocrisy of charitable institution. Pamela Oldfield's Victorian Workhouse, The Diary of Edith Lamar, 2004. An historical fiction novel for young adults following Edith Lamar, a wealthy girl who befriends Rosie, an orphan rebelling against workhouse brutality. Gilly Coates, The Workhouse Girl, 2012, focuses on Sarah and Lizzie, two orphans navigating exploitation and friendship in a Victorian workhouse. Other notable works: Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure's 1895 references workhouse as symbols of destitution. Elizabeth Swell's critique advocates of punitive pure laws in mid-19th century literature. These works collectively underscore that workhouse's role as a literal device to critique poverty, class inequality and institutionalised neglect in Victorian society. And to finish off, I've come up with my own fictional narrative that is indeed set in a Victorian workhouse. It's entitled The Stone and the Sparrow. London, 1872, Chapter 1, The Iron Gate. 12-year-old Clara Bell pressed her face against the frost-lit bars of St Mary's Workhouse, her breath fogging the iron. Somewhere beyond the coal smoke haze, the Thames flowed free, but here the air reeked of boiled turnips and despair. Her little brother Toby, just 7, clung to her patched skirts, his cough rattling like the keys on Master Grimshaw's belt. You'll stay together. Their mothers had lied, pressing a stale crust into Clara's palm before vanishing into the midnight fog. That was a week ago. Line up mugshots, Master Grimshaw barked, his cane cracking against the refectory table. Clara shoved Toby behind her as the matron began separating children into lines. Boys left, girls right. No, Clara lunged, gripping Tony's hand. He's all I've got. Grimshaw's laughter was a dry rasp. Family's a luxury for the deserving girl. Chapter 2, the bone room. Clara was assigned to the boneyard, a drafty shed where girls crushed animal carcasses for fertiliser. The crusher's iron jaw weighed more than she did, but Ellen, a gullet girl with eyes like cracked porcelain, showed her the trick. Leaning to the rhythm, let the machine tune your soul so your hands don't feel it. At night, Clara smuggled rancid marrow scraps to Toby in the boy's dormitory. She found him curled beneath a stairwell, his arms purple with bruises. Grimshaw makes us fight for supper, Toby whispered. Tommy Bates stole my bread, but I bit him. Clara wiped her tears with her filthy sleeve. Well, we'll escape, I've got a plan. Chapter 3, The Whispering Wall. The workhouse hid secrets in its stones. While scrubbing floors, Clara met Will, a one-armed boy who'd survived 3 winters there. There's a tunnel, Will murmured, nodding towards the cellar. Old coal chute leads to the river, but Grimshaw boards it every Mitcham. Clara's hope flickered. When? Tonight. At midnight, they crept past snoring guards. The chute was still open, its rusted hinges groaning, but as Toby squeezed through, a shout erupted. Thieves! Chapter 4, The Sparrow's Choice. Grimshaw's lantern flooded the cellar. Clara shoved Toby into the tunnel. Run! The master grabbed her braid, yanked her backward. You'll swing for this, red wench. But Will lunged his bony frame, colliding with Grimshaw. Go, he roared. Clara stumbled into the icy dark, Toby's hand in hers. Behind them, the workhouse bell clanged, but the Thames whispered promise of shadowy barges and jealous hours. A different kind of prison, but theirs. Epilogue. The Stone Crusher's Song. Years later, Clara returned to St Mary's, not as a prisoner, but as the legate inspector from the local government board. The boneyard had become a laundry. Grimshaw, withered and forgotten, shuffled past her without recognition. In the cellar, she traced Will's initials carved into the wall the night he died. Some said his ghost still haunting the coal chutes, helping lost children find the river. Clara spiraled. Sparrows always did know how to steal freedom from stones. The end. Note, the story weaves historical details like the Hanover Workhouse scandal and the 1870s push for inspections with themes of resilience and sibling bonds. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes this week's episode of an extra slice of history with the Butterfly Princess. Hope you've enjoyed this week's episode, and I very much hope you can join me next week for next week's instalment. But until then, have a lovely rest of your week, and I will see you all again very, very soon. Bye-bye for now. Take care.